going on, my folks? Hope you guys have all been doing well. For those of you who follow the channel, you'll know that from the last video, I had ventured down to South Georgia with my buddy Ice Climber to chase the Georgia Central Railroad.
Incredible.
Following Georgia Central L782R from its departure at Collins, Georgia, all the way up to just short of its terminus at Macon, Georgia. Getting good shots, hearing a wonderful Nathan P5 horn, and getting to bully my conductor friend. It's been good. It's been a good day. And now that the Georgia Central journeys have come to an end, there were still other trains near us that were within our grasp. Being in South Georgia, that did position us next to the Norfolk Southern South End. So following our Georgia Central chase, that is exactly where we went to, specifically stopping at Flovia, Georgia, to catch a little flurry of southbound action on the south end, which would start off with Norfolk Southern 28J promptly arriving after our arrival here. For my attentive foamers who are watching this video, you probably noticed that this train was being led by a Norfolk Southern -9.
Wow.
An increasingly rare sight on Norfolk Southern, which is honestly a very crazy thing to come to terms with. And this would be a trend for the little bit of time I was on the south end. Spoiler alert, I saw 4 trains while I was out here. 3 of them were led by -9s, and 2 of them, both the leading and trailing locomotives were -9s.
I can't believe this.
Which maybe 10 years ago, this would have been the norm. But now, in 2024, that is definitely not something that you see every day. And maybe some of you who have no idea what any of these locomotives are wondering why this is so rare. Well, the answer is because of that second locomotive that was trailing behind the leader of 28J, an AC 44 C6M.
Disgusting.
A locomotive on Norfolk Southern that has been rebuilt from a -9 and has gradually replaced the -9 as the chief power of Norfolk Southern trains. And seeing so many Norfolk Southern -9s in an age where their presence is gradually shrinking gives me the perfect opportunity to explain why the -9 is disappearing and how the AC 44 C6M and similar rebuilt locomotives are taking over railroads all across North America. To understand why the -9's disappearance is happening and why it's so crazy to see it happening, we gotta look at how they spawned into the railroad scene and how they actually work. On Norfolk Southern, you won't see -9 written on the side of the locomotive. Rather, you will see D9-44CW, the D standing for dash, the 9 for the 1990s when the model started getting mass produced, the 44 indicating 4400 horsepower, the C indicating a CC style truck arrangement, which simply put means that the locomotive has 3 axles per truck, and the W indicates wide cab. And these locomotives came as a replacement to the existing -8 locomotives on the GE side, and specifically for Norfolk Southern, the D9-40C, which was a standard cab version of the wide cab -9. And in an age where the locomotive market, which had historically been owned by EMD, was slowly being taken over by GE, the -9 was the product that really put General Electric on top. Thousands of these units were ordered by the different Class 1s, but especially by Norfolk Southern and BNSF. Norfolk Southern ordered over 1,000 of these locomotives and BNSF over 1,500 of them.
What?
And you could tell when you were out looking at these trains because they were everywhere. I'm gonna be real, y'all, I used to hate seeing these things, bro. There was so much other cool power that used to be running around. Yeah, all the standard cab EMDs, -8s, M-2s, all that stuff. And then here I am seeing -9s on every single train. Some days I would go out and every single locomotive, both leading and trailing, would be a -9. Even during the leaser craze, when Norfolk Southern was power short doing the rebuilds, which we'll eventually get to in this video, I was still only seeing -9s. The sight of these things used to make me sick to my stomach. I hated them. And I wasn't the only one. These locomotives have been nicknamed Trash 9s by foamers because they're everywhere, and even by certain railroaders because the prime mover, or the engine inside these locomotives, were known to have a higher incidence rate of blown turbos and engine fires, which you could definitely see on some of these locomotives. Regardless, however, besides these flaws, the Dash 9 definitely took over the locomotive market and proved pretty successful, being used by railroads all across North America and proving their worth in their efficiency and in their performance. They still, of course, weren't the perfect engine, and there were other things that could be improved within them. And the improvement to the Dash 9 would also come in the 1990s when General Electric released the AC 4400CW. The AC standing for alternating current, the 4400 indicating 4400 horsepower, the C standing for the CC style truck arrangement, and the W indicating wide cab. And in case you're wondering what the biggest difference is between these locomotives and their Dash 9 predecessors, the key is in the beginning of the locomotive, AC, the alternating current going into the motors.
What is that?
To understand why this is significant, we need to understand the general case of how locomotives work. So locomotives, of course, run on wheels. But the entire subassembly of the frame that surrounds the wheels and all those other components are called trucks. And being an assembly, you can remove the components from each other to get to the traction motors and the wheels. Now, the working principle of a locomotive is that you have an engine that's running, and as the engine runs, it turns an alternator. The alternator produces electricity, and that electricity gets directed to the motors, which causes the motor to spin the axle, and in turn, spin the wheels and get the train to start moving. And virtually every locomotive up until the 1990s used DC traction, or direct current motors, to get the train to move. And to understand how DC works, yeah, we're going down a rabbit hole, you need to go to electromagnetism. Stick with me now. So the fundamentals of electromagnetism is that electricity and magnets are very intertwined. I'm sure you guys know magnets, they have a north and south pole, and they have a field that surrounds it. If you have a magnetic field, all the magnetic poles will try to align in the same direction. Opposite poles will attract each other, the same poles will repel each other, all that good stuff. Additionally, magnets are also very connected to electricity because you can either move a magnet relative to a conductor of electricity to generate electricity, or if you have electric current moving through a conductor, it will generate its own magnetic field. So simply put, you can either use electricity to create a magnet or you can use a magnet to create electricity. And the DC motors that were historically prevalent over all locomotives take advantage of this principle. Let's say you have a giant stationary magnet called a stator, and you have a north polarized end and a south polarized end. Of course, in reality, you can't actually split the poles, but in here, we're just going to look at the inner part of the magnets that create the north and the south end. Inside the stator is something called a rotor, a conductor of electricity which, you could probably guess, rotates. And attached to each rotor is a pair of commutators. To ensure that electricity still goes into the rotor even as it's rotating, we use electrically conductive brushes. The magnet is almost like a cylinder, so you can imagine that it goes back a certain bit, and then the rotor also extends inside of this cylinder. So from a 3D view, it looks something like this. So currently, we have a giant stationary magnet, a rotor that has a conductor that goes into the magnet, and then we have the commutators that are attached to the ends of the rotors. And the working principle is that when you run a direct current through the brushes and into the commutator, the current will flow through the commutator, flow through the rotor, and then flow through the other commutator and then outside the other brush. While it does this, it generates a magnetic field, and then that magnetic field tries to align itself with the surrounding magnetic field of the stator magnet. And in order to align itself, the entire thing rotates. And to prevent the rotor and commutator from being stuck in one spot after the original magnetic field aligns with the stator, as the commutator and rotor rotate within the stator, the left commutator gets to the right side of the circuit, and the right commutator goes to the left side of the circuit. So basically, the entire circuit gets flipped, and this flipping of the commutators flips the magnetic field, and thus the entire cycle repeats itself where now this new magnetic field is trying to align itself with the surrounding stator magnetic field, and thus we have a cycle of motion. This design isn't perfect though, because you do have the risk of the gap between the commutators getting stuck in between the two brushes, and then you're not going to have any electricity flowing in between. So to fix that, we squeeze in another rotor and commutator pair, and then another, and then another. And having all these commutators and rotors introduces enough gaps and enough contact points to ensure that the momentum from a previous commutator and rotor pair will lead to the next one getting electricity and generating its own magnetic field, and then that cycle keeps repeating itself to produce a cycle of rotation. Rotation that can be used to turn wheels and thus create traction motors that are used on trains. And for the longest time, regardless of whether it was a GE or EMD locomotive, whether the trucks had 2 axles or 3 axles, this is how locomotives ran. And the lasting utility of these older DC locomotives will be exemplified with this next train, Norfolk Southern 391, being led by a now uncommon pair of Dash 9s. course, the principle had its success. These locomotives are still being used, and it was the industry standard for the longest time. But of course, there are shortcomings in the design. One, there's the maintenance aspect of it. Those brushes that are used are spring pressed into the commutator, and over time, with the friction between the commutator and the brushes eventually get worn down, and then you have to replace them. Additionally, DC motors could get burnt up very quickly because there's physical contact between the brushes and the commutator, and in high power applications where you're running a lot of current and you're trying to get a lot of motion, the DC motors can get very hot and you could burn up some of the components. So in an attempt to solve both of these issues, AC traction locomotives were introduced to the market and soon took over. Now, AC is a bit more complicated, so I'm going to try to explain it backwards. So in remembering that you can either use a magnet to create electricity or use electricity to create a magnet, we can take a curved piece of wire, rotate a magnet inside the curve, and the motion of the magnet's rotation relative to the wire will generate electricity. However, because of the north and south pole of the magnet, the direction of the electric current will flip from back and forth, because one pole will push the current one way and then the other pole will push it the other way. In other words, the direction is alternating. So, by rotating a magnet, we've created alternating current, which we can represent with a curve like this. And if we took two other pieces of wire that were rotated slightly off from the original wire, when we rotate that same magnet, alternating current will be generated in each of the wires, but it will be at different times just because of the offset rotation. So in this case, we started off with a magnet and we're creating electricity. Now let's take the three wires in the exact orientation that they are right now, and we can lock them in a stator like this. And let's say that instead of starting with a magnet, now we start with electricity. If we put an alternating current into each wire and offset the current in each wire in the same way that it was offset before when we had a physical magnet, the net effect of these offset currents is a rotating magnetic field. So basically, just by pulsing electricity back and forth at three different times, we've created a rotating magnetic field without actually having a physical magnet. And if we put a conductor, let's just say a metal cylinder, within the stator ring that we're using to hold all the wires, this new rotating magnetic field that we've created will now induce electricity on the inside metal. And then that inside metal, having electric charge flowing through it, will generate another magnetic field that interacts with the outside rotating magnetic field and starts to rotate. So basically, we just used electricity to create a magnet without actually having any physical magnets, and we're using the magnetic field to create another magnetic field to get rotation.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
Each conductor with an alternating current running through it is known as a phase. And if you have three of these, you have three phases. And for my Norfolk Southern people, this graph of the three-phase electricity is exactly why we have the three waves on some of the AC rebuilds. The more you know. Shout out to Brody in the cab.
It's popping.
I know I kind of just nerded out on y'all, but back to the trains. I hope that you can see that one advantage of the AC motors is that you don't have any brushes to check. Additionally, AC motors have much higher tractive effort than their DC counterparts. And combined with the fact that you don't have the risk of the motors overheating as much because you don't have those physical components rubbing against each other, AC motors quickly became the industry standard, to the point that the manufacturer of DC tractive effort locomotives basically no longer exists, and virtually every new locomotive that's manufactured today has AC traction motors on it, both GE and EMD. They simply have less maintenance and they pull stronger. And the evidence of the railroad's preference for AC powered locomotives will be seen with this next train, Norfolk Southern 369, with both an AC 44C6M on the front and an AC powered SD70 Ace leading this manifest. As I mentioned before, this train is being led by an AC 44 C6M, these units that have completely taken over the Norfolk Southern Railway right now. The AC, as you could guess, standing for alternating current, the 44 standing for 4400 horsepower, the C indicating that it is a CC style truck arrangement, the 6 indicating that all 6 axles have motors on them, because there are some variants of this locomotive that only have 4 motors on them, and then the M standing for modernized, indicating the modernized electronics that are on the locomotive. And if you're wondering where these things are being rebuilt from, they're being rebuilt from the Norfolk Southern Dash 9s. While many modern AC locomotives were completely built from scratch, as you can imagine, newer locomotives are expensive. And since the conversion from DC to AC doesn't involve actually changing the engine block inside a locomotive, railroads across the United States have just decided to rebuild their older units, and this is why the Dash 9 is disappearing and the AC 44 is taking over. Because these Dash 9s that used to be everywhere are now getting funneled into the AC rebuild program, and so now, as you can guess, AC 44s are now everywhere. And when I say these things are everywhere, I mean they are everywhere.
Go away!
There is no escaping these C6Ms. If you are on Norfolk Southern, if you go out and you don't see a train with a C6M on it, you've had a good day, truly. Because I'm gonna guesstimate and just say 80% of the trains I see have C6Ms leading on them, and if there aren't leading, 95% of the trains I see have a C6M somewhere in the consist. Which for the rail fan has now made a Dash 9 a good catch, which is a huge contrast to just even 10 years ago. Because the way people used to hate seeing these things because they were everywhere, now it's considered a nice find to see a Dash 9.
Nice.
Norfolk Southern currently only has about 320 Dash 9s left from the original 1,000 that they originally had, and out of the 320 that are still on the roster, 180 of them are stored. Meanwhile, as you could probably guess, the AC 44 C6M is now reaching almost 900 production units on the Norfolk Southern roster. For those of you who enjoy seeing the Dash 9s, all I can say is, catch them while you can, because although they were once the prime units, their time has come in favor of a new unit with modernized electronics, stronger traction motors, and higher performance. And although the focus of this video has been on Norfolk Southern, this isn't just a Norfolk Southern thing. The other Class 1s also have their own forms of rebuilding their locomotives. For instance, CSX was never really on the Dash 9 wave, they kind of caught on to the AC 44s, but they've been taking in their older AC 44s and rebuilding them with modernized electronics. Similarly, Union Pacific also has their own AC 44 rebuild program going on, marking these rebuilds as the C44 ACM. And this isn't just restricted to GE. Norfolk Southern took about 50 of their old standard cab SD70 locomotives, which are all DC powered, and retrofitted them with a wide cab and AC motors, giving us the SD70 ACC that you can count on NS rails. And if you look closely under the window on the cab, you can see the DC to AC logo in addition to the wave sign marked on some of these units. Just another example of how once prime technology eventually falls to the wave of progress. So what can you do besides catch them while you can? It may be a lot more difficult than it once was just a few years ago, but sometimes you get lucky, just like I did on this day, and with the last train of today, Norfolk Southern 394, with yet another pair of Dash 9s leading this train. What, my squad? That's all I have to say on the matter of the DC to AC conversion. If you guys have any more interesting information or think there's something I missed, feel free to drop it down below. I hope that you guys learned something, because as always, these videos take forever. And until next time, my friends, God bless. I will see you soon out on the high iron.